Hello, so thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone's doing well. So, I'm just going to give a brief explanation of what it is we're doing here. I'll start by introducing myself. So, for those of you that don't know, my name is Charles Goodhue, and I'm a guitarist and a music teacher living and working in Luxembourg. And a couple of days ago, I had a phone conversation with Jason Kavanagh, who's a good friend and a great musician as well. And Jason is a guitarist and a music teacher who's currently based in Canterbury in the UK. Now, I quite often have phone conversations with Jason where we discuss in some depth what we're learning in music and also what we're teaching. And I thought it might be a good idea to record some of these conversations and put them online in order to share some ideas and some of our personal perspectives on some of these topics. So the other day we had a discussion about a topic that's close to both of our hearts, and that is the subject of improvisation, or at least improvisation in music. And here's how the conversation went.
Yeah, so you mentioned about improvisation, and I thought that was a really good thing to talk about actually, because it's such a obviously it's such a broad subject. Um, but I don't know, maybe we could just discuss like how we both got into it and how it's developed, because I know for me, like over the years, it's kind of changed quite a lot how I perceive it and what I like about it, and you know the reason why I do it, sort of thing.
Sure.
Um,
I mean, so how did it kind of start then? What was your first kind of like encounter with improvisation then?
it's hard to say specifically, but I definitely like one example that I can definitely think of is when we used to jam like way back in the day.
Sure.
Um, and at that point, it was essentially Matthias was there quite a lot as well. But I remember playing with you quite a bit and just sort of, I guess we were both at the early stages of our guitar learning, and I guess irrespective of instrument, it's just you're kind of just using what you know. I feel like that's kind of like the underlying thing is like with improvisation, it's only ever what you have already, and you're sort of using that as a means of expression. And I guess that's why for me it's changed so much, because when I think back to when I first started playing and first started like jamming, for example, you essentially just want to make stuff sound good based on the tools that you already have, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
so for me at the time, I guess it would have started around about the time when I first picked up the guitar, and I just wanted to make things sound as good as possible based on what I already knew. But also, I guess more fundamentally, it was about just playing with someone, playing with other people. And I feel like that's probably the more important point is like, it doesn't really matter what you're improvising or what you're playing. It's just more about as cheesy as it sounds, it's more about like in the moment that you're playing itself,
Hmm.
present in that. So those are the two, I guess, two main things for me, especially when I was starting out. It was like, oh, I just want to like play music with people and see how it sounds and see what's going to happen. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking too much about any sort of technicalities from a musical perspective, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think really, I think there's kind of two main sorts of improvisation, at least in terms of what I do, or perhaps what we do. I'm not not trying to speak for you, but I think there's always there's the solitary improvisation when you're just kind of sitting at home on your own or wherever, with your instrument. For us, it's the guitar, and just kind of playing along. Okay, I'm going to try and make up some chord progressions and maybe try to fit some sort of melodies with that or whatever it is. And I think in that situation, it's a completely different beast from what you're talking about there, which is the group thing where you're playing with somebody else. Because there, as you said, it's so centered around interaction. you
Yeah.
know what is this person doing? This person's doing this, so I'm going to try to reply to that, or I'm going to take what he's doing and maybe build off that. And I think that's a completely different thing from just sitting at home in terms of solitary playing. And I think there are kind of benefits to both of them, really. I mean, with the solo stuff, if it's just you, I mean, you have absolute creative control. over your playing. And that is something which is, quite appealing. You have control over exactly, what rhythms you're playing, what harmony you're using, what melody, dynamics, tempo, all of that stuff. So there's a great deal of kind of like introspection, I think, that kind of goes up with that. And I think that sort of style of improvisation, it kind of has its limits. It has its own set of kind of limitations. Kind of much like you were saying before, it's like, okay, the limits there are, first of all, the biggest thing is like your own technical ability, your own sort of technical proficiency. If there's something I can't do on the guitar technically, there's obviously no way I can play that by myself, you know, but which you perhaps don't have because, when you're doing the group things, because when you're interacting with someone, we're both two different musicians. You may well, I'm sure you are capable of doing technical things on the guitar that I perhaps haven't done or I can't do, So there's maybe that element as well.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean, for sure. I agree. I didn't even think about solitary improvisation because for me, I guess it's so, the thought of it is so embedded in I guess like a musical interaction. So you need someone else there. I feel like when I'm playing by myself, it is improvisation, but it doesn't feel like it. And the reason I feel that way is because I just feel so limited to what I have already, in terms of what I have at my disposal, in terms of what I can do with my guitar, for example. So to me, even though it probably sounds like it, it doesn't feel like improvisory or whatever the word is. Because it always seems that it's something that's planned. And even if I do something that I wouldn't usually do on my own, it still doesn't feel like an improvised idea. It just feels like a recycled idea from, from stuff like that, But I guess having said that, you can only ever play something that you already know, right? I guess, because you can't you can't create, and you can stumble across something by accident, but like, surely it's going to stem from something that you already have in your locker, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. I get that.
When you're playing with other people, though, that changes everything because you're picking up on stuff that they're doing that might never have occurred to you. Which I think is one of the fundamental, it's one of the things that I love about improvising so much with other people is because, they might do something that you never would have thought of. And it's like, oh my God, like that's amazing. How can I replicate that? Or how can I answer that in my own way? So yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about solitary improvisation, but now that I do, I see your point. We're in complete musical and creative control. But I just feel maybe it's my own way of doing it, but I feel like I limit myself quite a lot in that way because I always go back to doing the same things unless I'm practicing something new specifically. But
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, quite often we do get kind of stuck in these ruts where we're practicing, or we have been practicing the same sort of ideas. Maybe they're kind of melodic ideas, scale ideas, chord progressions, that sort of stuff. And you're right, you do kind of recycle things. So I guess there isn't much which is truly kind of new in that sense. But I guess like a lot of improvisation is that, for example, if you play jazz or you go to watch a jazz gig or something, okay, they're improvising, but they are improvising on songs that they've played, tunes that they've played countless times before. They have a kind of harmonic, structure, framework that they're building off. They know that they're going to be playing a chord progression that does X, for example, A minor to D7 or whatever. And then within that, then they're trying to do something which is perhaps new. It's not completely new, of course, because they know where it's moving. It's not completely atonal free music where there's no structure whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure. And you're completely right. I think every kind of improvisation, whether it's group or just someone on their own, is kind of fundamentally limited to, I guess, certain constructs within the music itself. But that's one of the even with jazz, which is very I guess, like formulaic in how it's improvised. You're talking about chord progressions, structures of songs, even specific kind of melodic lines that you can apply over certain chord progressions and stuff. That is all kind of predetermined already, but it's the small little instances that make the improvisation itself so great. So for instance, if even the mistakes, man, like a lot of times people making mistakes or doing something kind of in the wrong place, that can be the best part. And it's crazy because, like, you think of like a perfect performance or whatever, perfect performance doesn't really exist, but like the best performances are usually the ones that are imperfect. And the reason they sound so good is because of that imperfection, But that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. I think when I first started getting into playing music more freely, it was the opposite. I was obsessed with like learning how to do everything properly. So I wanted to learn all the scales, and I wanted to learn all the arpeggios and all the harmonic structures and everything, so that I had this, I guess, catalog of ideas that I could draw upon in like an improvised scenario. So it's kind of, for me, it's kind of progressed, like where at first I wanted to expand my knowledge in that part. And then when I felt I had like a good bit of knowledge, I wanted to use it as well as I could. And now it's like I want to stray more away from like confined, like restricted sort of structures and stuff within music, So I feel like I'm nowhere near at the level that I'd like to be, but I feel like compared to where I was like years ago, it's like I have all this knowledge, but it doesn't actually really matter that much, because that's not really the thing that gets me when I'm improvising. It's not really about what scales or melodic ideas I'm using. It's more about the moment for me, as cheesy as that sounds. So it's kind of come full circle in a way,
Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, I guess it's in a sense, it's just a case of internalizing that sort of knowledge that you have to the stage where you don't actually think about it. Because I think it is a necessary stage you need to go through, is doing the learning, putting the hours in, and learning about the theory, because that stuff is incredibly important, particularly if you do want to improve in your improvisation. The vast majority of those people, those great jazz musicians, they know their theory like the back of their hand, but I don't think they're thinking, when they're solo, I'm gonna play a bit of good old Lydian in here. They're probably not. They're probably just judging, interacting with the other musicians and thinking, what can I do actually to make this music better, or what can I do to achieve the sound that I want to do? And I doubt they're thinking in terms of, or at least not strictly in terms of intervals and harmonic functions and stuff. I imagine it's a lot more free. But yeah, at the same time, I'm sure that they spent a long time studying that stuff rigorously, because I feel like you kind of have to.
Oh yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of, that's where I would say that I got a bit bogged down with it all. Is I got frustrated because I wasn't learning the stuff at the pace that I wanted to be learning it. And so when it came to an improvising scenario, I was unhappy with my own playing because it wasn't reaching a certain standard. But then when I think back on it now, it's like, that doesn't really, I know it's really important. And you're completely right in saying, like, especially all the jazzers, they spend out like thousands of hours, like learning all this stuff, it becomes so embedded in their playing that they don't even need to think about it anymore when they're actually doing it. But but then you have, that's why I come back to, for me, like improvising is the reason for me it feels like such a in the moment sort of thing, is when I think back of previous times that I've interacted with, like, for instance, when I was at university, I was in like a ensemble called the Scratch Orchestra. And this was like a free improv kind of group that was run by one of the tutors there. And the whole sort of, I guess, goal was to, because there were a lot of classically trained students on my course, one of the aims was to try and like loosen people up a little bit and get them to be a bit more free with their instrument and stuff. And it was really cool because what happened was you had a lot of musicians who had never done any improvising before at all, suddenly thrown in the deep end, but not having to worry about any like technical knowledge, or like, you know, don't worry about key centers or like scales or arpeggio, any of that kind of stuff. It was literally just about putting some musicians in a room together and seeing what would happen if you gave them a couple of little guidelines, you know, like saying like, oh, we're going to do a 5-minute piece of music, you know, and you have 3 notes that you can play throughout 5 minutes. You know, you got to place them in the right, you know, the right place for you. So you had these crazy, weird kind of free improvisations that, you know, if you listen to a recording of them, for me personally, they don't really sound that good or anything. But when you're playing in the moment, it feels amazing because there is like a tangible like energy that you can feel with people, you know, when, who's going to play what note when, or like, how can I react to it, and so on and so forth. So it was much less about, oh, let's play over these changes at like 250 beats per minute or something. It was more about, let's just see what happens, you know? So there's
Mm-hmm.
that for me, which is like quite prominent now. And even when I think of improvising around key centers and stuff, I still think about that sort of thing, trying to do the unexpected and trying to play around with whoever I'm jamming with, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think like yeah, when you get into the more sort of free stuff, and we could have a whole conversation on that alone, you know. And I think I'm kind of the same, kind of take the same position as you do here a little bit. It's like I like to be involved in that and to play that. It is super fun. It's really interesting to interact with people on that level. But I'm not such a massive fan of listening to it.
Mm.
I mean, for example, I do like some Ornette Coleman and some of the free jazz stuff, but really it's something I like to kind of dip into more just out of interest, out of curiosity as well. I'm not a huge, for me, like I love harmony, you know, and I love functional harmony, you know, and I like it perhaps when the boundaries are pushed, perhaps like when you have a little, you dip into the free stuff.
Yeah.
Um, like for me, I'm a big, as you know, I'm a big Coltrane fan, John Coltrane, and for me that's the perfect mix, you know, especially as later kind of quartet stuff where there's a strong tonal center, they have really clear ideas, there's a strong melody in there, and then they just use that as a kind of a point that they can then dive off, jump into a bit of free stuff, and then always bring it back. You know, there's always some sort of tonal center there, and for me that's important, is the balance, you know, is the balance. It's interesting what you're saying about having classical musicians on the course, because I think improvisation is definitely something which is neglected in terms of classical education, at least from the classical musicians I've met. You may have had a different experience, I'm not sure. But, you know, I've had, particularly now that, you know, I'm teaching, I've had some students who are very good, very really proficient kind of guitar players, and they've done all their exams in the classical, you know, grades and all that sort of thing. But they've wanted to do classes in improvisation because it's just not something that it's not an approach that they've ever really taken, you know. And I don't think it's a kind of a different way of looking at music, you know. I think, which is it's interesting for me because my primary kind of um, objective has always been to create something music, you know. I'll be honest, you know, I'm pretty rubbish at learning songs, you know. It's something I do, of course. I have learned songs, you know, and I do learn songs, but for me, I would much prefer to be sitting down and writing music or improvising or just, you know, figuring stuff out, kind of playing
Yeah.
with musical harmonic rhythmic ideas, that sort of stuff. So it's interesting to meet people who are very good at their instrument, but who look at music from an entirely different, you know, position. I don't
Absolutely.
know if that's something you've experienced before.
It is, man. And it's crazy because a lot of this, a lot of the people I went to uni with, who I studied music with, were like excellent musicians. All of them were. Um, and there were some jazzers there who are obviously much more into improv. But it's just interesting because a lot of the classical players, or who were rooted in classical music, were really nervous about improvising and just playing stuff that wasn't written on a page in front of them. And it's an interesting sort of like tradition as well, because I swear I remember reading that improvisation used to be a thing, like back in the Baroque days or whatever. You had these like improvised cadenzas or whatever they were called, where it was a whole section at the end of like a big orchestral piece where like one soloist would just take it away. So improvisation definitely does go back that far. It's just definitely not taught in that sort of spectrum of like musical teaching, I guess. So it is, yeah, it was really, sorry.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think like sometimes, when I have students, not necessarily coming from the classical world, but just students in general, and I kind of normally at the beginning when we first started the kind of relationship, I normally try to kind of ascertain where it is they want to go, what are their objectives, what are they into and stuff. And it's really interesting because quite often I float the idea of improvisation. I say like, oh, how do you feel about improvisation? Is that something you'd like to kind of have a look at, something you'd like to do? And I find it funny how a lot of people, their first instinct is to really distance themselves from that and be like, oh, not me, I'm not an improviser. That's something that is the improvisers do, which I find is like really strange, because for me, I feel it's innate, and not just talking for me. I just think in general for people, it is a completely innate thing. The idea of not being an improviser, I think it doesn't really work. I mean, like everybody is an improviser, even if you're taking it out of the musical context. How many of the things we do every day are actually planned? You walk down the street, the way that you move, the way that you interact with people on the street, you stop and have a conversation. That's not something that's pre-planned. That's something you're doing on the spot. You're making it up, you're improvising in that sense. So it's I just don't think it's the same thing with music.
But don't you think you can't really learn everything? And I think for a lot of people growing up, especially, I mean, I didn't start learning guitar until I was a teenager. And even then it was, I didn't start learning like classical guitar until I was like doing my foundation year before uni sort of thing. But I remember growing up, and, I just wanted to learn some chords, and I wanted to learn some songs that I knew. And that was the main thing. And and especially I remember when we used to jam, a lot of it was sort of started off kind of rooted in improvisation. It'd be like, oh, here's some chords that I've just learned. Like, what can we do with this? It was more about that. Whereas I feel if your musical tuition from a young age has been slightly more dogmatic in the way that you're sort of, you're it's a bit more linear in terms of your practice. So by the point of, that you're a teenager or young adult, you've kind of developed this method of playing music, this way of learning music, and any, trying to introduce something like improvisation is not even on the same level. It's a completely different thing. So I can understand why people get a bit apprehensive about it, but I think it does depend, because I've met other musicians who can't read a note, but they can play crazy amazing stuff, and it's just they've learned it all by ear. And I guess that's one of the fundamental differences. Being able to tune in with your ear is super important, and some people just haven't learned to play music that way. You just have to learn, and that's fair enough. But when I speak to some of my students about improvisation, they're not interested at all, because they would just want to learn, what's written on the piece of paper, and that's fair enough as well. But I don't know, from a personal perspective, I like to try and incorporate all of it as much as I can, pretty much. A nice balance if I can.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And you're right, yeah. If you have been studying classical music, perhaps you've been taking, as you say, a bit more kind of rigid approach to it, but where you've been studying music from the great composer, learning proper technique and stuff. And as you say, you can't really have time for everything, because I would say the majority of improvisers, at least the ones that I've met who are kind of predominantly improvisers, they're not people who have really taken a lot of time to study technique and stuff, at least not in the same sense that a classical musician perhaps would.
But then,
I think.
you do get these a lot of people who've spent years learn, they went to a conservatoire or whatever, they went through all of that, and then later in their life they get into improvisation and they're just insane because they have like this technique, ridiculous knowledge of like everything to do with music, and then you introduce improvisation to them, it's like a whole other level. You have these crazy session musicians who can play everything perfectly written down, and then they can just take a crazy solo as well. So you do have these crazy combinations. I think it's just, it depends how you start out. Like, I'd be curious to hear, like, when you first started playing, was it more just about, you wanted to play guitar because there were songs that you really liked that you wanted to play? Or was it purely from like, did you want to experiment around with music, or what was it exactly,
I mean, I think it was much the same as kind of how you were saying you were introduced to it. I mean, I was a teenager as well. I think I was about 16 or so. I started with a guitar teacher, and I kind of think,
Didn't you
much like a lot of guitarists, when you're learning. Sorry?
Didn't you start off with another instrument? Wasn't it? Didn't you play the trombone or something?
Yeah. I used to. That's true, actually. I used to play the trombone. So that was when I was a bit younger. That's true. I played the trombone, which probably helped kind of a bit, I think, particularly in terms of improvising. It's kind of interesting because for the trombone, you don't have fixed notes. At least not like the guitar. It's much like a violin, where you can actually capture every single note in between each note. So I think that's a really good instrument to work on your ear with, because a lot of it is trying to, make sure you're hitting the note in the right position. But yeah, I really only got into improvisation when I started playing the guitar and I started learning some blues, I guess, like a lot of people do. I still remember the first time I kind of improvised, it was just mind blowing. It was like, I don't know, it was something, looking back now, it probably sounded awful, but it was like, I think my guitar teacher was then just playing like a 12-bar blues, and we introduced the idea of like a minor pentatonic, to kind of solo over that. And I just couldn't believe that this sound was coming out of, like, I was creating this sound, and I think like that's something I love now, even with my students now, if they do want to learn improvisation, and we go over a similar sort of exercise, and you see the look in their face, it's like, I'm making this, and I instantly recognize that as, 16-year-old me being like, yes, that's because for me, that's still the aim, I still want to be like, just trying out new stuff and, just being excited by making sound. I think that's really the most important thing. And then it kind of just took from there. I think after that, we started with the blues a little bit, and then from there, I can ask my teacher. I wanted to learn a bit more about, like, because by that stage I was just playing open chords and maybe some bar chords and things. I wanted to learn a tiny bit more, so you started introducing, some more extended harmony, starting with 7th chords, 9th chords, whatever, 13th chords, going into this kind of stuff. And then just playing around with that, and just, for me, that's really kind of what started the sort of journey of just wanting to learn about how music works, and what can I learn to make my playing interesting, or at least to me. I think that was pretty much it.
That is it, man, because it was very similar for me, because I remember there was a point where I was like, where it became clear that I didn't want to just play chords or just play anything. It's like, I want to actively try and expand my knowledge of what we're dealing with here, so what I'm playing just sounds, how can I say it, just generally better, generally nicer. And by that, now I can sort of explain what I mean by that. I wanted to start incorporating like more varied harmonic language, making use of, like chord extensions, like you say, and how you can outline those within solo lines and stuff. And that really just went on for years, and it's gone on up until now, where it's like, I still, when I think of improvising, when I think of practicing improvising, it's more about practicing getting better at the tools that I'll be having to use when I'm improvising, So without trying to make it sound boring, it's just, I kind of spent a lot of time going through all the scales and going through all the arpeggios and going through all different chord progressions and like jamming those, um, to the point where it's like it became a bit kind of boring, which was obviously not a good thing, but that's what made me take a break from it and go back. That's why even now, like I kind of flick between, playing jazz stuff, playing like bossa stuff, playing some classical, playing some blues. Like I can't really stick to one kind of style of like guitar anymore. I just kind of want to play it all if I can, or all the stuff that I'm interested in anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
as you said, there's just so much to learn. It's like, and
yeah.
yeah, trying to find the time to learn all this stuff. It's difficult. I mean, like, what was if I don't know if you can answer this, but is there like the most important thing that you learned in kind of improvisation? If that's a kind of musical idea or a harmonic application or anything like that?
It's really hard to say, man, because I think that the biggest turning point for me, and I remember this really, really well, was when I was practicing at uni. And I think it was maybe it was my second year in uni. At this point, I was still like, because I get really obsessive about stuff. I was really obsessed with like just expanding my classical repertoire. I wanted to get really sick at like all these classical tunes. I remember like hearing there was some guys in the year below me. I think there was a quartet of them, and they were all just practicing like these jazz standards for an exam, I think. And it was I could obviously listen to quite a bit of jazz before, but just never really got that into it or anything. I remember hearing these guys playing, and I was like, "Oh my god, I need to be doing what they're doing." Like it just sounded so. And what it was just essentially jazz harmony, which was something that, as I'd been so indoctrinated with like classical stuff for so long, just the idea of like all these crazy altered chords and stuff was like completely new for my ears. So when I heard that sort of new harmony, which was new to me at the time, for me that was probably the biggest turning point. And I was like, I need to start learning this. Like this is a whole different language that I don't even know about, And so that was a really like pivotal moment for me, I'd say. Um, Going from like the tunnel vision classical to like, whoa, there's like so much more harmony and lovely rich like musical vocabulary that I just need to know. So
Mm.
that was probably the biggest turning point for me, and that's probably the biggest staple in what I enjoy about improvised music is probably functional jazz harmony more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm with you on that. I'm definitely a sucker for harmony, particularly jazz harmony. But I think it is also interesting to kind of to really take things back to kind of basics once in a while.
Mm.
For example, then a good way to do that, I think, is like perhaps playing over just a sustained kind of note or like a drone sort of thing where you're really restricting the harmony. So you're now not doing all these kind of progressions and substitutions and all these kind of 2-5-1 whatever. You're actually just basing it down. Okay, we're going to be playing one note here, and what can we do in a kind of melodic sense to make this interesting? Because you then have to start thinking about other ways that you can make it interesting, because you can't lean on the harmony. You can't use that as a kind of a crutch in some sense. Okay, I'm going to have to add some kind of rhythmic variety to my playing, in order to give it some sort of interest as well. Because if you're just playing straight eighth notes over a drone, eventually it's going to start getting boring. Or perhaps you can then look into modal ideas, modal functions. How can I use modes? How can I switch up the modes using, I don't know, is that something that you kind of ever get into?
Yeah, it is. And the fact that I hadn't even been thinking about rhythm is such an important point. Like it's such an important thing. And yeah, it hadn't even really occurred to me, because I get so bogged down. This is what I do. I get really bogged down with like harmony and really nice lines and stuff. But honestly, like the rhythm is probably the fundamental most important thing. And that's probably where improvisation probably originated in. When
Mm.
people have the advanced sort of instruments that we have today, it probably would have stemmed from like drum circles and stuff like that. So it is something that occurs to me. But again, I'm very limited to the practices that I sort of follow quite a lot, which is obviously with improvising, it's very much jazz oriented. So I'll get very stuck on playing like swung eighth notes, obviously with a varied rhythm in that. But yeah, it's massively important. It's not something that I feel I've practiced anywhere near enough, because I get bogged down in all the other stuff, as we all do. Like, it's very difficult to practice everything. But I remember when we used to play back in the day, we'd pick a chord progression, and it might have been 4 chords, but we could spend half an hour, 45 minutes on that change, and we used to change it up like a ridiculous amount. It would never be the same rhythm for more than like 16 bars, and it would go all over the place, but it was still, we kept it in time and it sounded good. And we might have been limited at the time to, with what we had, but we still found a way to change it up almost endlessly, which was kind of happened by accident.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly the thing, and you're talking about limitations there, and that's exactly what it was, for me, at least, I guess for both of us, perhaps, compared to how it is now, our, knowledge of kind of harmony was quite limited. We're mostly working with, major, minor chords, and then maybe some dominant chords, that kind of stuff mostly. So then it's exactly the same process that, because we're doing that and we're probably playing 4 chords or 3 chords maybe and whatever, you have to find ways of making it more interesting. So you have to sort of change up the rhythm, and exactly. Or you play it in slightly different ways. You would, I guess back then I was more into kind of like, I don't know, but more kind of rockier styles, I suppose. So I was doing more kind of like palm muting, and a lot of kind of syncopation and stuff in the guitar playing.
But also,
you're right.
Lots of we had a lot of ska, because I remember we were quite into that at the time. So there was that
Absolutely.
rhythm. I remember switching quite a lot between 4/4 and 3/4. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah.
I don't remember how we transitioned this sort of stuff, but I do remember that quite a bit. And like this sort of, it was a lot of the time it was like minor progressions. Because I remember the moment, the day when we met up for a jam, and you had just figured out the harmonic minor scale and how sick it sounded, like just playing it over basically any progression like a minor key. It's those sort of moments, where it's like, look, dude, I just figured this, like I just came across this, like listen to how this sounds. Like, oh my God, like that's insane. Like I never heard that before, and then, every couple of weeks there'd be something small that we might have learned that we were applying to these improvisations. And that's kind of how it grew. But yeah, I definitely remember we were limited at the time, but we did on it, like, some musicians might have very little at their disposal, but they really make the most out of it, and that's what's so great about improvisation is you don't have to be like some crazy pro or anything. You can anyone can do it. Doesn't matter how good you are at your instrument. All you need to do is be able to listen and join in, essentially.
Sure, exactly. And I think that's really the thing. Nobody's asking more of you. And I think coming back to what I was saying earlier about, people being really kind of shy going into improvisation, I think it's because as well that they hear the word improvisation, and then they're thinking about, these giants, they're thinking about, Charlie Parker or Jimi Hendrix or Ravi Shankar and all these people, who are just insane world-class improvisers. And, you're not going to be that, and that's absolutely fine, that's fine, because they already exist, and what improvising is about showing, kind of your personality through that, and you don't have to be shredding, you don't have to be, lightning fast doing all these kind of crazy technical feats, it's really more about what you kind of have to say in the music, and there are musicians that I quite like, who I kind of feel do that, perhaps don't have good technique, or not at least in the classical kind of traditional sense, and they're definitely not pushing the boundaries in terms of what they're doing harmonically. I don't know, like you listen to people like Neil Young or something, he's doing like a guitar solo with like 3 or 4 notes. You know, it's like it's really basic stuff. You know, of course it is, but it's, you know, there's a lot of feeling behind it, and he's doing the music that he wants to do. You know, and I think that's the main thing. You know, he's creating what he wants to create, and yeah, you don't always need to be doing crazy technical harmonic, you know, applications.
Absolutely. And to further your point, it's something that I'll admit I restrict myself by thinking of improvisation in a certain way. But we haven't even mentioned like what do you call it? What do you call it when rappers like, is it freestyle?
Oh yeah, freestyling. Yeah, exactly. Of course.
Freestyling, for example, which is incredibly. It must be insanely difficult to do. Um, you know, you have types of improvisation all over the world, which doesn't necessarily pertain to, you know, being a musical prodigy. It's just more about, it's almost like it comes from something innate about us being human, is that we, you know, we have this innate feeling towards doing it or something. It's hard to
Mm.
put it in words, but it's like, it's such an organic, like natural sort of thing. And like you were saying earlier, we improvise pretty much all day, every day in all the things that we do. So music is not really any different. It just so happens that there are certain things that can help us to create certain things on the spot, but that's not taking away from anything that doesn't take from those guidelines, you know. So there
Sure,
really is
absolutely
like,
right. I mean,
it's like ingrained within us as a race, I guess.
sure. No, no, absolutely. And yeah, you're right to mention, you know, freestyling and kind of hip hop stuff, because it's like, you know, okay, there you're not really dealing with melody, you know, not in general, you're not really dealing with melody, but you're definitely dealing with kind of rhythmic variety for sure. But then, of course, you have ones of styles of improvisation which are completely not musical. You know, you think about improvised theatre or improvised, you know, comedy, you know, these kind of things where I think it really is just a really natural way of kind of expressing yourself and just kind of capturing a moment in time. And I think, like, for me, that's really one of the most exciting things I find is, like, for example, when I go to see a jazz concert or any kind of improvised music concert, really, and you're sitting there, and the excitement is, you know, before the show, that the excitement is coming from, at least from my perspective, the excitement is coming from not knowing what's going to happen. You know,
Yeah.
you're about to witness something which hasn't been done before. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. The musicians, you know, okay, we talked a bit about it before, they have some idea, they know what tunes they're going to be playing, but in terms of the improvisation, it's going to be new. It's going to be, you know, due to a kind of series of unrepeatable events. And, you know, if it's not recorded, if it's just you sitting in that room with people, then that's the only time that's ever going to happen. You know, and once it's played, it's gone. You know, and I think there's something quite special about that as well. And that's something which really I find incredibly exciting.
Absolutely, man. And it reminds me of when I played quite a lot with like two good friends of mine, Ben and Joel Rocker, the Rocker brothers, and I used to play with them quite a lot. And actually, the most fun I had whenever I played with them was actually not when I was playing guitar, but when I was playing bass. And the reason for that was because, first of all, guitar is like my primary instrument, so I feel a lot more pressured when I'm performing on it, because I feel, you know how we all do. You know, you want to play well in front of your friends or in front of people. But when I was playing bass, it wasn't really the case, because it was like, well, this isn't really my first instrument anyway. I can just kind of have some fun with this. But more importantly than that, it was the fact that I could sit back in the performances and just kind of play the changes and listen to what everyone else was doing, and not really get too caught up in my own playing, but I could literally, you know, sit back for someone's solo and just like take it in. And those were some of my favorite moments of playing ever, because I could kind of take a back seat in the performance, no pressure on me, nothing, and just enjoy and observe like these amazing musicians I'm playing with doing these crazy things, you know, and maybe having a part to play where I might try and engage with them on some level. But for the most part, it was just being there, being amongst it, and being like present in that moment in time was like, man, it was amazing. And that's probably the most enjoyment I've had. Well, not the most enjoyment I have from improvising because I love playing guitar, obviously, but in that sort of sense where it's like you're just. That's why I think even as an audience member, you feel like you're playing with them, because you're all part of the moment. You're all, especially with jazz and that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm sure it's
Yeah.
relative to a lot of other fields as well, but particularly in that sort of scene, it's like you really feel like the crowd is part of the band and they all sort of bounce off each other, and that's what
Hmm.
makes it.
Exactly, and I think in some ways you kind of are, because you're part of you just being there. You're kind of part of the energy in that room, and the energy in that room is such a huge has such a huge impact on what's the music that's being made.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, I mean, I still remember I went to see a jazz saxophonist called James Carter. I
mm.
remember there was a lady in the crowd who let out some kind of yell, like just to express her, kind of that she was enjoying it.
Yeah.
And then just within moments, he replicated, her yell exactly on the saxophone. Really in quite a lot of detail. Even getting the exact same tone. And I think that's such a good kind of, that's just proof that you just being there in the atmosphere is a part of the performance.
Absolutely,
And I
man.
do kind of want to pick up as well a little bit on what you said about the confidence thing, because I think that's vital as well. That's such a key, you know. Yeah, it's I think like a lot of things, it's just so important that you're feeling comfortable and you're feeling confident in what you're doing, because that can have such a massive effect on your playing. And I think
Oh,
for me, yeah, that's something that I'm definitely quite conscious of. You need to the feeling of the room, and yeah, there is sometimes a lot of pressure, particularly if you're performing, you're on stage, perhaps there's people in the room, and you want to kind of show that you're doing, you want to play a good solo or play your instrument well.
it's a
But
massive
yeah,
thing.
sometimes that pressure really does kind of affect your playing.
It's huge, man. And yeah, it's crazy the difference it can make. I mean, I've done performances where I've felt terrible going into it and played really badly, came out of it and thought, oh my God, that was terrible. And then I've done other performances which have been like ever so slightly better, but I've felt amazing beforehand. So it just sounds great, and it honestly makes such a difference. Even if we're talking about like specifically the guitar, the smallest thing, the way that you attack the string with your plectrum, or like a specific line that you might not have had the balls to do, but you just go for it anyway, like small little things like that can sort of can all add up like throughout a performance, and that's how a performance can like build momentum, and like how a solo can build momentum, because especially as an audience member, if you can see that the person is confident and that they're really expressing what they want to express, it just changes the whole energy. It changes the energy in the room. It gives the performer more confidence. Then everyone can tune into their level and everything. It honestly, I can't understate how much of a difference it makes. And I've been the victim of lack of confidence, with my playing for a long time. But the moments where you just let go, it always just sounds infinitely better.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're completely right. Having the courage to perhaps play things that you're maybe not so sure about, and I think you can hear that in. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Coltrane thing, but
Oh yeah.
like in a lot of stuff like that, where he's playing these lines, okay, maybe Coltrane or Eric Dolphy or those sort of players, from the '60s, they're playing these lines which are completely out of the key,
Yeah.
deliberately, and that they're well aware before they play it. They're well aware that this is going to be out of the key. It's going to be outside of the their realm of harmony in that sense. But it works because they're so sure about it, and it's is exactly what they wanted to do. And I think if you approach that in the same way, playing exactly the same melodic line, but being unsure about yourself, then I think it would sound actually horrific in a lot of cases, because you can
It,
pick up.
it certainly would, man. It certainly would. It's crazy how much of a difference it makes. And you can hear it as well in recordings sometimes. You can hear when someone isn't quite at it, they're not really feeling it, or
Mhm.
and then vice versa, you can tell like, Jesus, this guy is absolutely blowing it away, and it's like
Sure,
there's
it's like
more than
on a
that, you know.
It's like on Giant Steps. I don't know if you hear the piano solo on there. A guy called Tommy Flanagan, and he's obviously like really unsure about the changes because it's like quite
Yeah,
harmonically
he
dense. You
struggles through
know,
it.
he does.
Yeah,
He's just like you can really hear it. It's just timid, just like, and you kind of really feel for him because Coltrane just done
yeah.
this like ridiculously roaring solo and he's just kind of plodding along trying to. But yeah,
Probably the
fair enough.
worst possible time ever to have to take a solo is just after Cold Steps.
True. Such a landmark record as well. You know, this is going to be listened to for like centuries, but people study it and then crap solo on it.
Yeah, but that's a hard tune to play over, man.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I couldn't do, yeah, I couldn't do better. I'm not saying it like that. I'm just using it as a point to demonstrate that, yeah, confidence is really,
Oh,
really.
100%, man. And that's why one of the greats like Miles was so exceptional because the confidence that he instilled in the rest of his band. He might have come across to other people as not so nice, but I'm pretty sure he always, he played with great musicians anyway, but I'm pretty sure he always like he just made them play better, just his presence and his vibes, I think. And it does make a big difference ultimately in the performance.
Yeah, of course. And I think Miles is a big one for him and Thelonious Monk. I think it's they always do this thing where they pick a note and it may not be the right note, but they just kind of keep playing it and just keep hammering it home. And eventually it starts to sound right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a skill to have, is to have the confidence the courage to kind of play that original note and know where you're going to go. That if I keep doing this, eventually you will agree with me. It's not like I've made a mistake. I'm going to convince you that this was the correct note to play.
Yeah, he was. I haven't really listened to Thelonious Monk that much, but Miles was definitely excellent at doing that for sure. He made the simple things just sound so crazy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this phone conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and hopefully we've been able to provide a bit of insight into our personal opinions and perspectives on this topic. I'm hoping in the future that we're going to be able to do some more of these. So if you do have any comments or any kind of suggestions of things you'd like us to discuss, any topics, subjects, anything like that, then just write a comment or write a message directly to me. So thanks again for listening, and see you next time.